as a journalist, I know sometimes you just go down a dark alley. So I said, you know what? I'm going to ask the FDA just early, just say, hey, what is this? How many devices are in this database? How big is this? And pretty early on, I got a sense that it was worth sort of digging deeper into. I think very early on, I found out there were 100 devices that had these special exemptions so they could report in these big batches. And then I found out it was even bigger than that.
Public health. It's on everyone's mind these days, from hand washing to emerging pathogens. Welcome to Transmission Control, an infection prevention podcast focused on your appetite for trailblazing thought, discussion, and innovations that will help you make informed decisions. Each episode, we speak with public health experts and safety champions from across the globe as they share their experiences, passion, and opinions. From investigative journalism to medical publications, we tackle real-world barriers to halting the spread of disease. Whether you are tuning in for education, inspiration, or to hear the stories that need to be told, thank you for joining us. And now, get ready to blast off with your weekly injection of insight on transmission control.
This week on Transmission Control, we speak with Christina Jewett, senior correspondent with the Kaiser Health News Enterprise team. She's writing about healthcare workers dying of COVID-19 for the Lost on the Frontline project currently. Her reporting on secretive FDA device reporting loopholes resulted in the release of 5.7 million records and was recognized with the Bartlett and Steele Gold Award, the SPJ Sunshine Award, and an Edward R. Murrow Award, and was a Goldsmith Award finalist, among others. She previously worked at Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting, where her work on hospital billing practices with colleagues was recognized with a George Polk Award. Before that, she worked at ProPublica and the Sacramento Bee, and she's a graduate of Indiana University. And Larry, I know you reached out to Christina to come on today as a guest because you've been a big fan of her work. And you and I have talked about this MAUDE database for quite some time. And I've done education programs, and I've encouraged the attendees to go to the MAUDE database and to research devices that are coming in as part of hospitals' procurement process. And to say, I work in sterile processing, or I'm in the OR, or I'm in biomedical or clinical engineering. I'm an expert on these devices, or I'm an end user. And so getting that information and making sure that that's part of purchasing decisions and the value analysis committees and all of those processes, like I've always been a champion for encouraging that. And then you introduced me to Christina's article, The Hidden Harm, or the Hidden Harm series. Right. And I read that and I thought, wow, maybe my push in that direction is kind of a fleeting effort.
Well, not so much fleeting, but I think what we learned today is that it's incomplete, that there are reports that are in other databases that are not available to physicians or to researchers like myself or to the public to get some insight into trends about a specific medical device, and may it be falling apart, may there be something that is causing it to have an increased risk of disease transmission. So I think the MAUDE database is still an excellent database. It still serves a great purpose, but we have to keep it more in perspective as a result of her work and, of course, her podcast today and what she discussed with us, that much more needs to be done. The MAUDE database is antiquated. It needs to be improved. But one thing she's pointing out is that we can't just talk about it, because in 10 years it's going to be the same way it is now. So we have to think about what we can actually do to have the FDA and the federal agencies to move forward, stop talking about it being antiquated, and actually fix it so it's a more useful tool, with the ultimate goal, of course, is that once these corrective actions are made to the MAUDE database, that we see a substantive reduction in patient injuries as a result of that specific work.
Well, you just talked about substance, and this interview is going to have a lot of substance, and I'm really excited. We're going to be back after a short break speaking with Christina Jewett, senior correspondent at Kaiser Health News.
Brought to you by 17 Studios. Let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Joining us now is Christina Jewett, senior correspondent at Kaiser Health News. And today we're going to be talking about the FDA's adverse event medical device database and whether or not it really tells the whole story. So, Christina, I will tell you that this MAUDE database, as it's referred to, has been an area that Larry and I have been discussing for quite some time. We're so excited to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So, Christina, why don't we just start with a little bit of your background, not just your current role at Kaiser Health News, but just tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
I hate to age myself, but I've been an investigative journalist covering healthcare for about 13 years. That started at ProPublica in 2008, and then I went back to the West Coast to the Center for Investigative Reporting, which is called Reveal now. Worked there for about 7 years, and I'm a reporter on the enterprise and investigative team at Kaiser Health News now. It's been about 4 years.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about how your interest in investigating medical device safety and the FDA oversight of devices, how did that come about?
Well, there's been some just amazing work in this space over the years, and I sort of tiptoed in with some skepticism. I thought, well, so much has been covered. There might not be another story here to do, but it was just a really fascinating area because it seemed like regulation was really sort of spotty and lax. So I started sort of looking around and reading white papers and calling around to try to find out, okay, is there a story sort of worth the 6 months of investigative reporting time to dig in here? And pretty quickly and surprisingly, I found out there absolutely was.
So, Christine, I have a question for you. How did you find out initially that there was this database? We're all very familiar with MAUDE. And maybe explain the acronym for some of our listeners or however you want to interpret it. I call it simply the Adverse Device Report Database. Is that something that you're comfortable with and the listeners will understand, do you think, or do we need to have more description for that?
Yeah, I think that's pretty simple.
Okay, so as you were doing your work, I'm fascinated by how you were able to find something that was so hidden it wasn't there for anyone to find. And you did remarkable research and find out exactly where it was. You were able to get incredible detail on it, and you were able to actually cause, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the FDA to actually reverse course based solely on your research. So how did you really find out? Could you tell our listeners a little bit about how you found out that that adverse database existed and that there were hundreds of thousands of reports there talking about, for example, surgical staplers and malfunctions, maybe as opposed to deaths, but these malfunctions were hidden from physicians who might otherwise have used them? How exactly did you find that needle in the haystack?
Well, the very beginning is kind of disappointing because it's just basic journalism. There's a lady named Madrice Tomes who's been quoted in the media quite a few times. She used to work at the FDA. She's a little bit critical of the FDA. So I called her and said, hey, what's going on? What's been written about? She has a job as the administrator of a proprietary version of MAUDE, essentially, where she works with academics who want to take a look at it. And I said, what's interesting? And she said, well, she went through 4 or 5, 6 different things. And then she finally got to, there's this alternative summary reporting program. And I said, well, what's that? And that's where the exemptions kind of came up.
So define that a little bit more, this alternative summary findings report. And I realize this is the hidden harm. So right. What is it?
So basically there's different flavors of exemptions. And this is just one flavor. And she was saying that if you read some MAUDE reports, it just says this is an alternative summary report. We're submitting 800 incidents about X device. And so you could tell just by reading that language that it was sort of tip and then iceberg. And she and I both were kind of like, wow, what's in the iceberg? So right away, there's sort of like, as a journalist, I know sometimes you just go down a dark alley. So I said, you know what? I'm going to ask the FDA just early, just say, hey, what is this? How many devices are in this database? How big is this? And pretty early on, I got a sense that it was worth sort of digging deeper into. I think very early on, I found out there were 100 devices that had these special exemptions so they could report in these big batches. And then I found out it was even bigger than that.
And why do you think the FDA had this database, if you will, this repository of reports? Why do you think it was there? Their mission is to ensure patient safety. Was that exactly what it was doing? Was it improving patient safety?
This was born out of scandal, actually. I talked to the architect of this, and about 20 years ago, there was a news expose about unreported harm with medical devices, and that resulted in new, extremely heavy, I think including criminal penalties for failing to report medical device harm. So then the reports came flooding in at such a devastating rate that the FDA couldn't keep up. There was just way too much. There was a stack of 15 and there were just tens of thousands of reports rolling in. So it was at that point that this director said, I need to help my 15 workers. They're dying here. And maybe we can fix this by identifying devices that we're just going to kind of roll up. And when that happened about 20 years ago, there was actually a page on the FDA website. If you dig deep into the Wayback Machine enough, you can find that they said, okay, well, there's alternate summary reports for these 8 devices. And so it wasn't very secret then, but as years passed, more and more devices got exemptions and that information disappeared. So nobody really knew what they didn't know.
You know, you said 20 years ago, and 20 years ago sounded like a long time to me. But it really isn't. We're talking about the turn of the millennium and the 2000s, and a lot of the technological advancements that we see in medical devices were pretty well established. Minimally invasive surgery, I mean, maybe with the exception of robotics, and there are definitely plenty of others, but a lot of the surgeries that people are familiar with 20 years ago from 2000, that's pre-minimally invasive surgery. Lots of advancements happened at that point. But 20 years ago, 40 years ago, we're talking about a lot of stainless steel instruments, not a lot of components, not a lot of electronics, and the pace of play for development of medical devices is exponential, just like the technology that we see in our cell phones. If you think of what a cell phone looked like in 2000 versus what it looks like today in 2021, and you start to apply that sort of general public understanding of how tech has gone, so has medical devices. And so when you say 20 years ago, that's really not that long. And it surprises me that we only had 15 people working in that department just 20 years ago.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting myself.
So it seems then that, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's fair to say that the FDA had many reports to deal with. They had to find a way to organize this. We can appreciate that, very much so. But I'm a little confused, Christina, in that when this whole system was developed, was it true that it kind of went through this method rather than through the Federal Register? It went through this method where the public wasn't notified and couldn't comment? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. This did happen without notice and comment. You'd think that this would be the kind of thing where you could dig deep enough into the Federal Register and find the list that gets updated every couple of years of devices that have these exemptions, but there was just no such thing. I mean, I don't mind doing that digging. It was just not there. So what I did was I went through MAUDE and I figured out just a list of keywords. And with Madrice gave me access to her data, and you can actually do this on the FDA website too. Just do like a free text search of MAUDE. And so there were certain sort of code words for when there was going to be a device batch mass event filing. And there were things like the acronym ASR for alternative summary report. There was the term exemption. There were several terms of art that I would just search for and just start making a list of the devices that I could figure out had an exemption. And one of those was a surgical stapler. And that's when things really got kind of even more interesting.
But just because a device has an exemption where we're still kind of codifying the information and filing it, did it really turn out that patients really were being harmed, not theoretically, but in reality, because these reports were not available to the public? Was that really happening?
Well, here's sort of the argument for harm. The surgical stapler is a device that can kill someone. If these things lock up, they sever a vessel, they're supposed to staple it really fast, and they lock up and people bleed to death. This has happened. There are examples of that were discussed in the article. And so what I found to be a really compelling example is the fact that there was a surgical stapler by Covidien, which is part of Medtronic, that had an exemption. It wasn't reporting that there were any problems. And I found a doctor I believe he's in Michigan now, and he had written a paper called The Unacknowledged Problem of Surgical Stapler Injuries. Had been doing a surgery and the stapler locked up, and he looked to MAUDE and said, wow, it looks like there's no problems here. And the other thing that can happen when it looks like there's no problems here is that medical device reps and big data firms that want to talk about what device is safest can say, hey, buy the Covidien, it has 0 problems. Don't buy the Ethicon. Look at all these problems you can find in this adverse event database. So you wind up with sort of a skewed market because the transparency just isn't there.
And what did the FDA do to try to minimize the impact of that skewed market or the skewed amount of data that were public? Certainly the FDA would have responded to his written paper pointing this out. What did they do in response?
Nothing. I mean, there was radio silence. When I talked to this doctor, he was shocked. I mean, his quote was something along the lines of, geez, at the time I thought there was a cover-up. Now what you're telling me is just really stunning. I mean, his report came out unquestioned. I mean, there's still to this day a body of research in PubMed that I question. I mean, there are devices I found that had exemptions, and there's lots of research written off of MAUDE. And given what I know now, I would really think there's a number of reports that could be sort of opened back up.
So particularly as a result, and I appreciate the hard work you've done on this, Christina, it's really remarkable. As a result of the work that you've done, I would naturally conclude then that there are no more medical devices of any sort that have an injury that are due to a malfunction, device-related malfunction, device-related injury, device-related death. There are no such devices that are in any type of hidden database. I am concluding that. Am I wrong?
You're wrong. I'm sorry. There's a whole new flavor of exemption, and this was discussed at the very end of that article. It has a new name. It was noticed in the Federal Register. There are supposedly marker reports in MAUDE where you can find out, much like the old system, how the new system works. I'm trying to remember. It's called Voluntary Malfunction Summary Reports. So that is the new flavor of hidden reports, and it's sitting there waiting for another investigative journalist to dig in.
Interesting. Is this a consequence, do you think, maybe in the medical device field that I've been in for a quarter of a century? Sometimes you can have a tension between the FDA's oversight and not wanting to understep or overstep, and then the manufacturer being given, in many cases, the ability to self-regulate. Is the tension between FDA oversight and being maybe a little aggressive toward the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer self-regulating and saying, it's okay, we have better watch under our own roof than anyone else? Is that a little bit of a root cause of some of this? And if that's not, what would be the reason why we're continuing to see devices such that someone like myself, a researcher on this, who has written papers on identifying outbreaks, for example, with medical devices, why would these not be public? Why would they continue to be? What is the root cause, do you think?
I mean, you're asking an investigative journalist. So, I mean, industry has quarterly reports to Wall Street. I mean, they want to sell their products. I mean, that is their objective. They want to return money to their shareholders. It's not in their best financial interest to have every embarrassing, malfunction sort of out there for the world to see.
But that's why Congress gives the FDA money to regulate medical devices now.
Right, but I'm sort of talking about why there's ongoing exemption programs, because, there's not like a will to have every single little problem out there. I mean, the FDA does want deaths reported, and that's obviously a major sentinel event. So that should be out there for most devices. There are some cardiac devices where the deaths are actually reported as a summary report, but there are arguments for that as well, because some of these are used on people as sort of a last resort type procedure. And so they think that the death numbers should be, subject to summary reporting.
So Christina, you're hitting the nail on the head of something that I think is really important that I have not understood. And it goes to how we define a medical device as being the cause of a death. So if a medical device is linked to a death, associated with death, or caused a death, how many devices do you think are actually causing death, but that are being listed in databases as malfunctions, causing us not to have a real sense of how many deaths are associated with any given device, because it's going to go back to how we're defining a medical device related death. Do you have any insight for us on that?
Yeah, so that's sort of the misclassification where they're sort of clicking the box of injury, but then you read the narrative and the word death or some acronym, something that means the same thing as in the actual report. I mean, that's sort of a different animal than what this investigation was about. And I know there's been concern about that over the years. I'm just not really the expert on that issue.
Because I think that issue about, and kind of a follow-up question to that, kind of goes to our interest all in what is the standard or the burden of proof. If a medical device might have been involved, should we have the presumption, kind of what we might today during the pandemic, the presumption that a virus caused certain symptoms? Should we have the presumption, do you think? Would that benefit all of us as consumers if we had the presumption, or would it complicate and kind of cause the system to collapse if we had more of a presumption that the device was somehow to blame? Or should we maintain it where we have the presumption that the device really is innocent until proven guilty? What would you be more comfortable with?
I mean, I would probably be more comfortable with more disclosure and more uncertainty. Because, yeah, right now it is association. I mean, it's not like there's people getting hit by a truck and there's a device report. It's a little, that's sort of an absurd way to describe it. I mean, usually there's some suspicion that the device played a role in the person's death. But, I mean, I'm sort of in favor of transparency across the board. So I'd rather see it the way it is, because if there had to be some sort of private tribunal to decide whether it's association or causation, these things can be litigated for a decade. And no one would want the causation determination. And I think that wouldn't be appropriate to make lightly. So, I mean, the way it is now does make sense to me with the way the deaths are reported.
So I think I'm hearing that you think probably the best thing we can do for the public is to be more transparent about what we're doing, understanding there's still limitations, understanding medical device manufacturers still have a lot of data that they have to deal with, and they have to find ways of codifying it and conveying it. But is that one of the biggest mitigations or one of the biggest corrective actions that we might do, as you're saying, is to become much more transparent? Or, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is there something else that you see might actually, through all of your research, what might be the one thing you'd like to see, not necessarily the FDA, but the public health, the CDC, or even a researcher like me? What would you like us to do to follow in your footsteps to make sure that listeners can feel more confident that when they get up in the next morning, the people really looking out for them and that they can safely go and seek medical care?
I mean, I think one thing that I would like to see is this new sort of flavor of an exemption program, this voluntary malfunction summary report. If there's someone who has the wherewithal to file Public Record Act or the Freedom of Information Act request or whatever means they need to get the FDA to sort of put that on the website or get that information out there. Because what I learned, really digging into this space, is that there are big tech companies that analyze this data and make money off of their ability to advise health systems, hospitals, doctors on what to buy, what's the safest. So if they're not seeing the right data and they're telling doctors what's safe, I mean, that's really concerning to me as a potential patient.
Christina, I think you've given us a lot to think about. And I'll say too, Larry, you made a really great point. And it's, what can we all do to try to improve this? I heard transparency, but I want to add one other thing. It was a constant theme. It sounded like resources, right? And I think that those resources don't have to be human. I think in the context of our discussion at the very beginning, we referenced there wasn't enough human resources to peruse through the data. But we also talked about technology advancing over 20 years. And I feel like we probably do have the technology and the ability to mine data in a more effective way. So, maybe at some point it's the classification that needs to change, that there's associations, but that we do something with the data to make stronger correlations. Because like you said, Larry, death or cause of death, trying to figure that out and really attribute it directly. And then, Christina, like you said, it's going to bog down the whole process because it could sit in litigation forever because they don't want that very strict label placed on their device. And so the whole thing gets dragged out and we don't get value out of it. Maybe that's the kind of change that we need to see to get to the level of transparency that we really all want. Do you think that's a possible solution?
Yeah, I don't know what the solution is. I just know that there is a very concrete new way that things are being hidden. And if there's more transparency into that, it is going to sort of eliminate the possibility that 10 years from now you have someone publishing a paper about the unacknowledged problem with the next medical device that, lo and behold, you search court records and find, several people have died from malfunctions. I mean, the device makers need that accountability of transparency. They need to make a better device, make a really good device. Don't, make a good enough device and have your reports hidden. I mean, strive for excellence. I mean, that would sort of be my solution.
To your point, Christina, I think we need to better discuss how to incentivize improving quality, because I know quality directors in companies want the product to be safer. And so if there's an incentive for it to be safer, where you are required to file the reports and then see those filed reports decrease in number from year to year, the quality director feels very proud because he's doing his job. He's working within the company to make a better device, as you say. One other thought that as we wind up here that I'm curious about, Christine, is as I'm doing more and more work and continue to use the MAUDE database as a means to kind of catch a problem with a device prior to the press, is I'm noticing that some of the MAUDE reports seem to be often coming from Europe, and that when I initially got into this and researched this with duodenoscopes, there were many, many reports in the U.S. Then, of course, there was the downside for hospitals where many of these reports ended up on the front page of newspapers. And I could only imagine a situation where a CEO might say, this is problematic. Have you noticed that medical device reporting in the U.S., that while the number of reports may not necessarily have dropped, that the frequency of reporting in the U.S. and identifying those cases and submitting them to the FDA, is that decreasing despite not necessarily a decrease in risk? Or do you have any thoughts as to why I see European reports appearing, seeming to me to be reported more to the database than those from the United States? Have you noticed or seen anything like that, or have any thoughts on that?
I've been up to my eyebrows, tragically, in this year's project, which has been looking at why healthcare workers are dying of COVID. But if I were looking, my first place I would look, again, is that new exemption program, voluntary malfunction summary reports, because that could be why you're seeing an apparent decrease from the U.S., because things might be going into that bucket.
Which seems, when I thought we were moving forward, your point's well taken, it could be suggesting we're moving backwards, because it may be that those hidden repositories were to be a program that's terminating. If these reports that are visible in MAUDE are decreasing, you bring up an excellent point. Could they be increasing in another database, one that I don't have access to? That would be a problem, it seems to me, if that were the case. But I had not thought of that. You do think that could be the case?
I think that could absolutely be the case. I hate to reveal how cynical I can be, but a colleague and I once kind of joked that every investigative journalism story that one does, could go back in 10 years and do it again, sadly, because just human nature, corporate nature, bureaucratic nature doesn't change that much over time. So I would be entirely unsurprised. I was pretty shocked when I looked at the list of devices that were eligible for this new voluntary reporting program, and it was, your highest risk implanted devices. It was just like, dang, here we go again. So, we accomplished something. The FDA responded to our story and released 5.7 million records. But did we sort of change the world in the most enduring, eternal way? Nope.
Well, I think you have, Christine. I think you're being very modest. I think you have changed it, and I think you've paved the way for some of us to follow. It's just going to be much more challenging. Part of life is being Sisyphus, pushing the rock up it, only for it to fall down and push it up again. But I think a lot is still learned each time we push that rock up. The next time, it's not all for naught.
Yeah, no, and I don't forget, and I don't have any plans to do anything other than investigative journalism for the next 20 years. So give me a couple years, give them a couple years to hide some troublesome sayings. And maybe that's, a future story for myself or something, for you to look deeper into, Larry, and call me first.
So you're going to keep up doing the good fight? You're not going anywhere?
There's no revolving door for me.
Well, we're all really glad to hear that, and patients across America will appreciate that.
I hope so.
That was Christina Jewett, senior correspondent at Kaiser Health News. And Larry, I know I mentioned this, but you and I have taken a great deal of interest in the MAUDE database, and not just related to medical devices, but we've had so many conversations around, how do you determine that cause of death and classifying and collecting that data. And I will say she didn't leave us on a very upbeat note when I said, could data and the ability to manage data with the power of the computers that we have today and the analytics that we have, I was kind of trying to put a hopeful spin on it, but I got to tell you, her article indicates that there's much bigger reasons to be concerned. And she certainly left us with that feeling. So I want to get your takes on some of the key takeaways, but I definitely really enjoyed this interview and it opened my eyes today.
Yeah, I thought it was really insightful. She's also done some very fascinating work in surgery centers and the regulation of surgery centers and how safe are they, so that as we move from only hospital procedures more and more to outpatient centers, are we, for the convenience that we're being given and to go home the same day, are we really at risk of dangers that we might not otherwise have realized? So she's done fascinating work there too. I think today she brought up some excellent points, and that as much progress as we continue to make, we have to still keep the pedal to the metal. That if we're complacent, every step we took forward, we'll just have that one step go backwards. So I was really very interested in her talking about that and how we have to stay on top of this, keep moving this forward. And now she seemed to be talking about, I think, the FDA, and although we have so much intelligence today, artificial intelligence, so much computer power and efficiency, that the FDA's MAUDE database seems still to be in another century. And I'm not quite sure the gap between why the MAUDE database is where it is now compared to where it could be. And it raises a whole lot of interesting questions about why we're not there. But she has shown that a lot of medical devices and their injuries that are associated with the malfunctions are not coming out necessarily, that typically deaths do, but then a death may not be attributed to a medical device. Even though the device may have been responsible for death, it may be categorized instead as a quote-unquote malfunction, in which case it can just get lost, and there can just be an inadvertent, unwitting filing system that does that. But I think what we know is there's a lot to do. Medical device regulation is something we need to keep a focus on, and the public demands that we do what we can do in order to assure public safety.
Well, speaking of doing what we can do, Larry, you and I are just getting started. It's early in our days with transmission control, and I can see where Christina is going to be coming back on a future episode to talk about other work, such as you mentioned the surgery centers, which was highlighted on the CBS Morning News. I can see her coming back and sharing more information with us and being a recurring guest over time.
And I think that there's one thing in the common in the guests that we're going to have. These guests are real trailblazers. These are people that are real movers and shakers, and I'm really excited to talk to them, to hear what they have to say, and to particularly in today when infection prevention and public health is so important. We've got a lot to do. We've got a lot we will do, and I think listeners will find this incredibly fascinating to hear our conversations and to learn from what each of these podcasts teaches.
All right, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Transmission Control on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Larry and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Transmission Control.